With 3 years of data, one college basketball researcher has pinned down the best way to build a roster in the transfer portal era, and he's here to help break it all down for us.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton. You are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content. We're not just here November to March. We are here every single day, 5 days a week, all off season long. This episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you all by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Folks, don't want to bury the lead any longer. I am thrilled to be joined today by Evan Miyakawa, the creator of EvanMiya.com. I told you this offline, Evan, but I use this website every single day. It is fantastic data for college basketball enthusiasts, an incredible database of transfer portal information, tracking rosters, all sorts of excellent stuff. But what I want to talk about today is recent research that you published on your blog discussing the ideal way to construct a roster, because I think this has been a huge talking point in college basketball, in the transfer portal era, in the NIL era. What should we be doing? Should we still focus on high school recruiting? Should we just try to completely redo our rosters in the transfer portal every single year? What is the balance? How much should we prioritize returning players? All of that stuff. And Evan, I'm going to give you an opportunity to just explain what your findings were in this research. And then we can kind of talk about some teams that seem to follow that finding and the success that they have had.
Yeah. So the motivation for this, the time that we're in now with the transfer portal, we had over 2,000 transfers in the portal. We had several teams completely have to start an entire squad from scratch with having 0 returning players and getting an entire new squad of 10 plus players in the portal. So we're in a completely different era of recruiting than we've ever seen before. And especially with COVID year players still being in the mix, where you have guys who are playing their 5th, sometimes even 6th year of college basketball, it's kind of redefining how people think about traditional high school recruiting compared to the portal, compared to the importance of returning players. And so every single coach that I've talked to kind of seems like they're just figuring it out on the fly. So I wanted to actually look at the data the last several years with all of this portal movement, with name, image, and likeness now in play, and with one-time transfers being pretty much the norm nowadays. I wanted to look at the data and say, okay, what different roster construction strategies actually have been the most successful for high major teams, specifically in terms of teams making the tournament, making deep runs, and winning national titles. Basically, what I found was rule number 1 in terms of my best practices from the data. This is not a shock. Recruit good players. Now, this comes easier said than done, but basically what this means is you should always try and get more talent. Whenever you're looking at a returner, a transfer, a freshman, whatever, if it's a player who's going to dramatically increase the talent level in your squad, go for that player. That's kind of, number 1, that's basic. Everyone understands that. But outside of that, the more interesting stuff that I found was that teams who prioritize building their roster around returning players, specifically looking at teams that during a season played returning players who are on the roster the previous season. When they played those players at least 50% of the team's available minutes, these teams had markedly better performance during the season than teams who were mostly reliant on newcomers, be that transfers or freshmen. Basically, what the data showed was kind of regardless of what your preseason roster talent was, whether it was a team amassed of, mostly returners or mostly transfers or freshmen or a mix therein, if you compared your team to other teams of a similar talent level, those teams that were mostly on the returning side in terms of putting most of their reliance, most of their minutes into returning players, ended up faring slightly better. But if you look at the last 3 national champions, UConn twice and Kansas, they were both above that 50% mark. And when you looked at teams that were, had what we would call good successful seasons, whether that's teams who finished with a 1 seed or teams who finished in the top 10 at a KenPom or at EvanMiya.com, which is my website, almost all of these teams, about 90% of them, had returning players play at least 50% of their team's minutes. And when you looked at teams who were outside of that or more reliant on new faces, they generally were a little bit below expectation compared to the level of talent that they had on their roster.
And I think when you think about that, it's fantastic research, and I think it highlights a lot of things that I think what I liked about this research is that I don't think it's that shocking in the sense that it's kind of what people would have expected, but it's really nice to have some actual numbers behind it, in particular when talking about the returning data, because I think you look at some teams that obviously have to redo their entire rosters. We're going to talk about both Kentucky and Louisville later in the show. Obviously, they did not have a choice. They lost their coaches. They are choosing it for Louisville. It's a good thing for Kentucky. We'll see how it shakes out for them, but they kind of didn't have a choice. But I do like the idea of the continuity and how important it is. For me, it feels like really early in the season in particular, as you see teams kind of get through the season and start to kind of put the pieces together. But and this tracks with the teams that we're expecting to be good next year. My co-host Isaac and I, we've done our top 25 way too early. We've already done them a couple of times. And the teams that are generally getting traction amongst teams that are going to be, potentially in the top 5 next year, Kansas, Alabama, those are 2 of the top ones. Houston, Iowa State, Gonzaga, like all those teams that they kind of fit in that bill, they all fit this. Kansas returning Hunter Dickinson, DeJuan Harris, KJ Adams. They got some really talented guys coming in. Houston returns a lot of key pieces. Iowa State returns basically everybody. They get Joshua Jefferson, a multi-year guy. Like, it feels like it's really kind of tracking with the teams that we're expecting to do well. And I think that that's an encouraging sign that a lot of the data here is kind of speaking to what we're perceiving are going to be those teams that really have successful seasons.
I agree. And if you look at the most successful team the last 2 seasons, the back-to-back national champions in UConn, basically what they did was they identified the key players who could return for them to fill a majority of those roster spots and be the main part of the rotation. And then they said, okay, who can we get from high school and through the portal who's going to dramatically raise our talent level compared to if we didn't get those players? And so you look at both the last 2 seasons, they had a couple key transfers, they had a couple high-impact freshmen, and the rest of their team was comprised of veterans who had been around at least a year, if not 2 or 3. That really seems like the way to go in this age. And you look at teams like Marquette, Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, you mentioned. These teams, along with UConn, have kind of established a culture with how many other teams are losing players left and right to the portal. They've established a culture of recruiting key pieces each year, but largely basing their roster around key returners so that you sort of have this balance of mostly returning players, but a few new fresh faces that are going to dramatically raise your talent level and thus your chances of success during the year.
I'll be honest, Evan, I think you've changed my mind a little bit on UConn, because I've been lower on them heading into this next season. I've been like, well, the amount of talent they lost from last year's roster is significant. 4 of their 5 starters are gone. But looking at the roster, this year's offseason really kind of hits this exactly to a T. They get, an incoming freshman, Liam McNeely, who's going to be an impact contributor. He's a talented kid. You get a transfer in Aiden Mahaney, who in theory could be there for a couple of years. And then you're supplementing those guys with a bunch of returners. Obviously, Alex Caravan is the notable one, but you also have Hassan Diarra coming back, Solomon Ball, Samson Johnson. And it feels like, based on this data, UConn is just right back in the thick of things with a similar construction. Obviously, they keep their coach, which was a big deal because it looked like a little tenuous for a bit there. But I was kind of like, I'm a little out on UConn. I'll have them borderline top 10. But now, kind of based on this data, it feels like they're right back doing the same thing again. And why wouldn't they potentially be another top 5 team, number 1 seed for a 3rd year in a row? It feels like it could be possible based on some of this.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're basically doing the same thing they've done the last several years. Get the couple pieces you need to fill in those key roster spots that you've lost due to players going to the NBA or graduating. And, Liam McNeely is a great example. They've had a key freshman the last couple seasons. It was Donovan Clingan 2 seasons ago. It was Steph Castle this year. You've got the key freshman. You've got the key transfer piece, but you're building on that. The thing that's really interesting to me about this is because of the portal, because of name, image, and likeness, every single team has the ability to potentially improve every single roster spot on their team. If you're willing to shell out the money, you can basically get any player you want from most teams in the country to potentially improve a roster spot slightly over what you have. But I think that comes at the detriment a little bit of, the continuity piece, which seems to be really important. Obviously, if you have the opportunity to get one of the best players in college basketball, you always go do that. But if it comes at the if getting a player through the portal comes at the expense of losing a player in a similar position who's of equal value, and maybe you thought you could keep them, but they end up leaving because they're not happy, that oftentimes ends up being a slight negative over just keeping the same guys that you have, making sure they have the incentives to return, and building on what you had the previous season. And so I think one of the keys to this is not just the importance of relying on returners, but also making it a priority to, when you get new players, prioritize doing everything you can to keep them for multiple years, as opposed to letting them go after one season to another school. Because those are the teams, you look at a Tristan Newton, right? He was a transfer for UConn, and he stayed 2 seasons, and he became arguably their most important player this last season to win the national title game. That bump from that first year to that second year was a really big deal for him. And the teams that are doing that, you look at a Mark Sears at Alabama, another great example. After being at Alabama for multiple years, that's really where he fully reached his potential. And these are the teams that are getting the most out of their transfers, is getting good players and then keeping them around for multiple years.
Well, 50% retention is not going to be an option for the 2 main schools in Kentucky. Of course, Kentucky and Louisville, new coaches, entirely new rosters. Evan and I are going to switch gears, talk about those rosters, the incoming transfer classes, what we think this season might play out like for them. Coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, I love sports and I never want them to stop, but as the playoffs are winding down in the NBA, NHL, we got fewer games and the sports are not happening as much as we want. Fortunately, FanDuel lets me keep going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right, there's something for everybody every day, all summer long. You're a baseball fan, World Series odds right now, not a shock. The teams we're looking at here, Dodgers favored plus 280, Yankees behind them at plus 450, followed by the Phillies at plus 550. If you're interested in any of that, head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Evan, coming back here, wanting to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to post a link to the research here in the show notes for those of you who heard that, who want to see more. There's some fantastic charts, some data, a lot of kind of evidence supporting what Evan researched here. So if you want to check that out, definitely click the link. If you're driving, maybe wait, get home, then click the link, check out the research after that. But Evan, I want to kind of pivot and talk about the 2 teams that outside of maybe Arkansas and UConn, have kind of driven the majority of the offseason conversation. That's Mark Pope's Kentucky Wildcats and now Pat Kelsey's Louisville Cardinals, the 2 teams in Kentucky. You have them both ranked as some of the better transfer portal classes. Obviously, it's a quantity situation in the sense that both of them were bringing in a whole bunch of transfers. Let's start with Louisville. They're ranked 2nd in your incoming class ranks. And I think that matches up pretty well with the eye test. This is a really, really nice class of talent. Joining Pat Kelsey's team, they get Chucky Hepburn from Wisconsin, Terrence Edwards from James Madison, a couple former Pac-12 guards, Javon Hadley and Corin Johnson, Ali Khalifa from BYU. Like, there's a lot to really like about this program. And obviously, again, kind of tying it back to your research, they didn't have an option to bring 50% of their talent back, but key number 1 was having good players. And if we're being honest, if Louisville returned 50% of their talent, they probably wouldn't have as many good players. That was not a good team last year. So I think this feels like a hard reset and a moving in the right direction for Pat Kelsey and this new look Louisville team.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of improving on your talent level. This is a situation where you kind of want a clean house because they did not have a good team last year. The culture wasn't good. And so having a fresh start with a new coach is important. To that end, the interesting thing to me about Louisville's transfer class is that every single transfer, according to my transfer projections, has a better projected rating, which is called Bayesian performance rating. It's the main metric that I use to evaluate players. Every single player has a better projected BPR for this upcoming season than every single Louisville player had in actuality last season. So in other words, the performance of every single player that they've gotten through the portal is expected to be better than what they got from any of their players last season. That's pretty incredible. Yeah. And also exactly what Louisville needed. And so when you look at this team, you mentioned I have them ranked 2nd in the country in terms of incoming transfer class. A lot of that has to do with the number of players they got, but all of them are also good players. They're high quality players. I don't see any players on this roster who I see as massively kind of below the level of what's needed to compete, at the high major level. And so I'm really impressed with them. And I think they've got kind of all the pieces that they need to be good. And they especially have prioritized 3-point shooting. If you look at a lot of the players, who they brought in, 7 of the players who they have coming in shot at least 34% from 3 last season, which is a good mark. And 9 of those have hit that mark in a previous season. Chucky Hepburn, for example, who's going to be one of their best players coming from Wisconsin, he only shot 32% from 3 this year, but he was over 40% the year previous. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So when you look at this lineup, they could, at any point have 3 or 4 guys on the court at any given time who are going to be a threat from deep. And that's way different than having just 1 or 2 guys and the defense being able to key in on them. So I think that's really going to translate. I think that's going to fit Pat Kelsey's style and should lead to a dramatically different style of play than what Louisville has had in the previous seasons.
Right. And one of the factors here, obviously, is being able to acquire players who fit your system. And that's harder for a computer model to be able to pick up on in this situation. But I agree. I think Kelsey brought in guys who fit his system, who do what he wants to do. I also noticed that it's a difference from Kentucky, who we'll talk about momentarily. Both brought in a fair amount of high major talent, but Louisville seemed to really prioritize bringing in guys who already played at the high major level. They got a couple guys from Charleston following Coach Kelsey, and that makes sense. Obviously, those guys are going to acclimate to the system a little bit quicker. Kason Pryor, I know, wasn't a high major guy, but South Florida is a very good mid-major program. Terrence Edwards was phenomenal, but the rest of the guys kind of all come from that high major level. I wonder for you, from just using BPR and the models that you have, do you think that is potentially giving them a bump, or how does it factor in with that versus, like, again, we'll talk about Kentucky in a second. They got a fair amount more guys who are coming in from the mid-major level.
I do think it's important to get guys who have high major experience and are veterans at that level. One of the things I've seen in my algorithm that basically predicts how good a player is going to be transferring from one school to the other is the level of competition that you play against really does matter. And there's certain characteristics that don't translate as well from like the low major or the mid-major level to the high major level. So, for example, one of the most prized commodities in the portal is a guy who can score, 15 points per game or better. Those guys are, one of the most sought after qualities in the portal. But when you look at guys who have been primary scorers for their teams, but coming from the mid-major or the low major ranks, and they don't really have a lot else to their game other than just being able to score, a lot of times those guys don't end up being anywhere near as good when they transfer to the high major level. Whereas guys who, at the lower mid-major level, who can score but also do a lot of other things well, they play make, they can rebound, they can defend well, those guys are a lot more secure, kind of moving up in terms of conferences. So when you're comprising a roster, especially with a roster like reset, like what Louisville's having to do, I really do like going for proven commodities at the high major level, along with a couple guys that who have followed him from the previous team, who fit his style. They know exactly what they're doing. I definitely think it's a safer option. You're not taking as many risks there. And I think that's what's needed for this team.
Yeah, moving on to Kentucky, I think, we kind of talked about the high major guys versus the mid major guys. And I think for Mark Pope, you could clearly see a direction, even with the mid major guys. Like the most notable non-high major guy they brought in my mind, at least, is Kobe Brea. And Brea is just like, he's a distinct role player. He's an incredible 3-point shooter. He's not a high volume guy. He's not somebody, you're when you bring in a guy who averaged 18 points a game in the Big West, and you're like, let's see what that looks like. Sometimes it works. Latrell Wrightsell was good. Zion Poland was good. Sometimes it doesn't work. But when you're bringing in a Kobe Brea, it's like, we know what your role is going to be. We know what we're going to ask you to do. We know you're going to be really good at it. We know that your volume, I mean, he wasn't even a high volume player at Dayton. He's not going to be a high volume player at Kentucky, but that doesn't matter. And even guys like Amari Williams and Almanor, the other guys they have coming off the bench, like, they're going to fill specific roles. Whereas the roles that need to just have the ball in their hands a lot and do a lot of facilitation, do a lot of scoring, those were filled by guys coming from the high major level, like Kerr Kriisa from West Virginia, or Jackson Robinson, of course, following Coach Pope from BYU. So it feels like, again, this is a class that you had ranked 6th in their overall class, 12th when it factors in departures, which, again, ton of really good players left Kentucky. That's not really Mark Pope's fault. That's just how it goes. But you look at this roster, and I feel like a lot of the pieces really feel like they're going to fit together. And I'm really curious how long it takes Kentucky. Like, I host a Locked On Zags podcast as well, and Kentucky and Gonzaga are facing each other on December 7th. And I'm like, I think this might work out great for Gonzaga, because I'm not sure Kentucky's going to be ready to be great by December 7th, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're a lot better in February. So that win's going to look real good for the Zags heading into March. That's my kind of perception of this team right now.
I do think that they're hopefully going to be able to grow a lot during the season and kind of figure out what lineup combinations work. We may not see a set lineup for most of the year until you get kind of into February and March.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that really impresses me about this assembly of players for Kentucky is they don't really have a star player.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a player on this roster who's likely to be in the conversation for all conference honors or all American honors.
Mm-hmm.
But the depth on this team is really good. When you look at especially their top 8 with Andrew Carr, Owe, Kriisa, Butler, Garrison, Brea, Robinson, and Amari Williams, I have all of those guys ranked inside the top 130 transfers in the country. And so when you end up projecting the impact that every single one of those guys is going to have, I think they're arguably going to have some of the best depth, the best 8-man rotation in the SEC, arguably, because every single one of those guys is ranked really highly in terms of their value that they're going to bring on the court. So I think that's kind of a nice problem for Mark Pote to have. He's got a lot of good pieces, and he's going to have a lot of time, hopefully, to kind of figure out how to mix and match and make that work. One of the interesting things about the way that he assembled this roster, especially from the beginning, is, Mark Pope at BYU is known mostly as an offensive coach. His offensive sets and the way that he got the pieces to gel together was just fantastic, especially this last season. And so when he came over, 4 of the 5 transfers that he got initially were all ranked inside the top 25 defensive players in the portal. I think that was super intentional because he's trying to establish a really good foundational defensive pieces, guys who he knows when they're going to step on the floor, like your Lamont Butlers, for example, are tried and true defenders who are going to be reliable. And then you look for the offensive pieces after that, your Andrew Carrs, your Kerr Kriisas, who are going to really be exactly kind of the offensive style fits that you need. But you start with the defense first. I don't think that's typically a usual approach for a coach to take, but I think this was very intentional by him and his staff. And I think that was the right way to build this team.
Well, Louisville had the second highest ranked transfer portal class, but we're going to close out the show talking about the team at the very top, Rick Pitino and the Red Storm of St. John's, all that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience, that's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you are looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, Evan, moving on, want to talk about the 2 other teams in the top 3 in terms of your transfer portal rankings on evanmia.com. Again, check out the website, check out the linked article in the show notes if you have not done so yet. Fantastic stuff from Evan about roster construction. But I wanted to talk about first St. John's, who has the number 1 transfer portal class, and then Kansas State, who comes in at number 3 behind that Louisville team that we already talked about. Let's start with Rick Pitino, because last year they did the whole overhaul thing. They had to, new coach coming in, a lot of players left. I think they kept 2 guys. One of them was Joel Soriano. I'm not even sure if I remember who the other one was, but it was a brand new roster. And they had a fair amount of success. I think you could make an argument that they probably should have been in the NCAA tournament. It's an argument we made on the show back in March, but they weren't great. It's not like they were a slam dunk tournament team that didn't make it. They had their ups and downs, and some of that kind of came from having a new roster. But now they return some key pieces. RJ Lewis comes back. Ejiofor comes back. Brady Dunlap comes back. But they also go out and get, I believe he's the top-ranked transfer in your class. He's certainly who I think is the top-ranked transfer in Kadari Richmond from Seton Hall. Tremendous, versatile guard. They get Devin Smith from Utah. Really nice class coming in. They're ranked number 1 on your site for a reason, Evan. What do you see in this transfer class and how it might work for Pitino and the Johnnies this year?
If the reason that Louisville's transfer class was high is because of the quantity of players that they got who are good, for St. John's, this is all about quality. They only have 4 transfers coming in, which I think when I look at the top 10 teams, there's only one other team who's that few number of transfers coming in who's ranked in the top 10. So this really is all about Kadari Richmond and Devin Smith. Kadari Richmond, you mentioned it. He's the best player in my portal projections. He's the consensus best player a lot of other places as well. His offensive value is really high. He did pretty much everything as a point guard for Seton Hall. His defensive rating was also really, really good. He was the 6th best defensive BPR in the entire country last year, a top 10 defender according to the analytics. And there are not many players who are that good offensively and defensively in the portal. So when you add those two things together, I think he's extremely valuable. He dramatically elevated Seton Hall's performance when he was on the floor on both ends of the court. So I think whoever got him was going to be in for a major treat. I think he's a great fit for Rick Pitino and what he needs from his point guard position. And then you pair him with backcourt mate Devin Smith from Utah. This is going to be one of the most interesting backcourts to watch because both of these guys are traditionally point guards. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they play with each other. But I also have Smith as a top 20 player in the portal. And I think he's, potentially one of the most underrated players in the portal. He, also did a lot of things for his team. He scored, he rebounded, he had 6 assists per game. He shot over 40% from 3. His stats across the board were just really great. So I think with those two players, along with the few other pieces that they've added, this really goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, Rick Pitino had to have a fresh start last season. He did that. He was pretty successful, should have been in the tournament. Now he's building on that, adding some really, really good pieces on top of it, returning some key players. And, I think they're going to be a serious force in the Big East this year.
The thing that's so fascinating to me is we have this collection of older coaches in college basketball, and they kind of fell into 3 factions. Some of them just dipped. They were like, I don't want to deal with the new era. It's time for me to retire. It's time for me to move on. Some of them have kind of fairly staunchly refused to adapt to your Tom Izzo's, where it's like, I'm going to continue to do things the way that I have done them and not necessarily pay attention to the new era and the new things. And Michigan State didn't do what they were supposed to do last year. We'll see how that goes for them going forward. And then you have a group that is very quick to adapt and very willing to kind of not only adapt, but sometimes even be on the cutting edge and making those adaptations before other coaches come around to it. Rick Pitino, obviously in that category. I would put Mark Few in that category as well. And even Scott Drew at Baylor and others. But for Pitino, one of the oldest coaches in college basketball, and he's out here, kind of doing exactly what your model says. He's got some, I don't think he's going to have 50% returners because a lot of his guys were older last year, but he's got some key pieces returning. He's got some talented players coming in the transfer portal. We'll see if some of those guys stick around for a couple of years. I think Richmond and Smith are both in their final year, if I'm not mistaken. But we're seeing a coach who, at his age, is still finding ways to be kind of on the cutting edge of college basketball and making adjustments and adaptations that many of his contemporaries have been unwilling or unable to do. And I think that is fascinating. And I think it sounds to me like it's going to lead to a lot of success for the Johnnies. I think they're going to be really good this year.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think that this is going to be the big year. I think, there's the ability to build on what they did last season. And, especially with how well they closed the season, the momentum that they had, then being able to add these clearly talented players who are arguably, going to be better than most of the pieces that they had last year. I think this should be a really fun year for them.
Final team I want to talk about here is Kansas State, and we're talking about older coaches. Not the case here. Jerome Tang in his 3rd year, a longtime assistant for Baylor, of course. Very successful in year 1 with the Wildcats. Not so successful last year. Had some issues with personnel. Had Naquan Tomlin wasn't able to play for him. I think that kind of set the team back. Didn't make the tournament last year, but really tremendous offseason for Jerome Tang and the Wildcats. This team, for the complaints that we saw in like November, December of like, oh, they're not willing to spend NIL and Jerome Tang's unhappy at Kansas State. Like, they ponied up because they go out and get Coleman Hawkins for apparently $2+ million. But even before that, they'd already landed Doug McDaniel from Michigan. Achor is fantastic, kind of 3-4 hybrid from Samford. Ganan Yenso, Bay Fall, Brennan Housen from Villanova, like 2 mid-major guards who were like over 15 points a game, Max and Christian Jones. Like, this is a really tremendous transfer portal class. And again, they're not returning 50% of their talent. They're nowhere close. I think they got 1 returning guy who was in the rotation last year. But this is a team that I'm really interested in. I'm really excited about. And when I saw how highly regarded your models had this transfer portal class, I was really excited to kind of get your takes on this group and what it might look like in a really loaded Big 12.
It was already a nice job before they got Coleman Hawkins, but I have Hawkins ranked right behind Kadari Richmond as the second most valuable player in the portal. So once you add that in, that third best incoming transfer class in the entire country, ranked second behind St. John's in overall transfer activity, which means they were, one of the absolute best teams in terms of raising their talent level through the portal. Yeah. If you have the ability to do that, you should do that every time. And that's what Jerome Tang has done. He's added a lot of talent. I've heard this mentioned a couple other places. I think they have one of the highest ceilings and the lowest floors of any team, because if these pieces really gel, this could be a top 15 team in the country, or you can have issues and miss the tournament, so it should be a really exciting year one way or the other. But I'm really excited about this team. Coleman Hawkins, I think I mentioned this before, but he's second ranked in the portal. The thing I like about Hawkins is that he gives you a lot of offensive versatility. He can score and be a primary scorer for your team, but he can also be a great secondary piece. I mean, he was a secondary piece to Terrence Shannon the last several years, and he was really, really good in that role. He could score, he could facilitate, he could rebound, he could stretch the floor. There's been discussion that he could play the 5, the 4, potentially even the 3 for Kansas State. I think he's the kind of player who would allow you to do that. So that's really exciting. And so I think he's great. Doug McDaniel was one of the earliest commitments in the portal, one of the earliest good players to enter the portal. I think he fits the mold of what Jerome Tang has had in terms of really good, dynamic, shorter point guards. Yeah. The last several seasons, and I think his season was a little bit marred because of how bad Michigan was. But, the first month of the year, Doug McDaniel was taking the entire nation by storm, really, with his performances. And I think that's really more close to his true level when you put him with other good players. So I have him ranked really highly as well. There's a lot of athleticism on this team. There's a lot of 3-point shooting on this team. So, all things considered, this should be a major improvement over what they had last season.
Yeah, Jerome Tang last couple of years brought in high-profile mid-major point guards who have turned things over. Like Marquise Noel was fantastic. Tyler Perry was fantastic. Now he goes out and gets a guy who put up elite production this previous season, but he didn't do it at North Texas. He did it at Michigan. And I'm really excited about what he can do with Doug McDaniel when you look at the success he's had with his previous point guards. And you mentioned Hawkins' versatility. And I think that, to me, feels like the biggest key for this team, because I look at this roster and I'm like, they have too many bigs. They don't have enough wings. Like, somebody who is projected to play 4 is going to have to play the 3. I don't see any other way. And it's either going to be Hawkins or it's going to be Achora, because I feel like otherwise, I'm not sure how the minutes are going to shake out. If Hawkins can be kind of a connective wing, shot 37% from 3 last year, if he can fill that role for this team and kind of allow Onyenso and Achor to play together, potentially, they're going to have length. They're going to have a ton of size. They're going to be a great rebounding team, can still space the floor. I really like the upside, but I'm with you on the other note, too, of if this doesn't work, if the pieces don't connect together, if the mid-major guards don't step up, like, things could get kind of, I don't want to say ugly, but a little convoluted and difficult when you're competing against Houston and Iowa State and Baylor and Arizona and all those teams in the Big 12, you got to have everything in line. And Jerome Tang's got to have a really tough coaching job ahead of him to get this team to the upside that they have. But if he does it, they're going to be really good, and he's going to look like one of the best coaches in college basketball.
Yeah, I agree. He's got a great challenge in front of him. I mean, just imagine if you're able to roll out, a Coleman Hawkins at the 3, a Chor at the 4, and an Onyenso at the 5, and that works. If you're able to have that lineup, even just for brief stretches against, the other team who won't have those options, that could be extremely a big advantage for Kansas State. So if it works, it's going to be one of the most fun teams to watch in the country for sure.
Evan, thank you so much for taking the time to come on to the show. I really appreciate your expertise. I think your website has helped me tremendously. It's helped many college basketball fans over the last couple of years. Looking forward to seeing what you do next. And thanks again for coming on the show.
I appreciate it.
That's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We got some NBA draft coverage coming your way the next couple of days as we get into the draft on Wednesday and again on Thursday. Then we'll continue our offseason talk, finish up some transfer portal and recruiting conversations as we get into July. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, peace out.